recorded so that you will have access to it. You'll be sent a link at the end of the session, probably tomorrow actually, because it'll be 8:30 by the time we're finished tonight. And you can then replay this session any number of times you like. You will also be given a link to a PDF version of the PowerPoint. The link will remain on the system for a month, so you've got a month to view the PowerPoint again if you want to. View the lesson again rather. You can download the PowerPoint, but you can view the lesson again for a month. Okay, so just to let you know that it is being recorded. And I will start bang on 7:30. So if anyone is late, we are expecting quite a number of people to join this webinar tonight. So anybody who's late, they will just slot in as we go along, and hopefully they'll catch up to where we've got to. Okay, so it's I make it 7:25, so I will start in 5 minutes time. Okay, now I'm going to switch my microphone off for just 5 minutes, so don't panic that I've lost sound. I'm just putting it on mute for 5 minutes. Okay, just while everybody gets organised. So carry on putting some chat in the chat room if you want to. So at the moment we have Faye, Joanne, Jodie, Karen, Nicola and Sue. So good evening everybody. And Georgina is the host, the main host. She's the person that is the kind of overseer of the webinar, but she will just be silent in the background recording. But you might see on your, I'm not sure what you see on your page, but you might see Georgina Sexton, but I'm Karen McAteer and I am the deliverer of the presentation tonight. All right, so I'm just about to switch my microphone off for a couple of minutes, okay? Oh, she's actually not there. Georgina's just told me that she's actually not there. Okay, if you could just, so don't panic, you're now about to go mute. I'm about to go mute anyway, okay? Okay, can I just check again? I've switched my microphone back on that you can all hear me. We're just about to start. Yes, lovely. Okay, so it is 7:30. This presentation will last an hour. As I said, there are quite a few others who I'm expecting to join us. They may well join us at some point, but we're going to make a start because there's quite a bit to get through, and I don't want to run on and on and on. I appreciate it's a Thursday night and you've probably got other things you need to do. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is a presentation on addressing the needs of pupils with an autistic spectrum disorder, or ASD. It is basically it's an introduction to autism, so we won't cover by any means um, a lot of ground tonight because autism, as I'm sure you're aware, is a huge subject. But what we will do is give you a bit of an introduction to autism, and we'll have a look at some of the development of it and how it's been diagnosed and how that has moved forwards since the 1940s, really. Oh, Mel. Evening, Mel. And Yvonne. Evening, Yvonne. So apologies that I will go through it at quite a pace, but I want to get through as much as I possibly can with you tonight. And as I said, the session is being recorded, so you can replay it in your own time for any bits that you missed. So don't worry about trying to take notes. This is part one, really, of a two-part series of an introduction to autism. So we're going to cover the first part of it tonight, and then at a later date we'll probably cover the second part, okay? And it also links directly with, there's a level 3 qualification in autism, and there are links to this through this PowerPoint, okay? So here we go. Hopefully, sorry, I didn't put my cursor on the right place. There we are. Now, what you'll see here, this is the learning outcomes we're going to have a look at today. However, I think it will highly be unlikely that we cover all of them. So we're going to concentrate on the top 3, perhaps 4. So we're going to look at the original paper developed by, the original ideas really, by Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger. We're going to look at and recognise the similarities and differences between autism and Asperger syndrome. We're going to look at the triad of impairments, which is the main method for diagnosing ASD, and how you can, we're going to break that down and look at it quite carefully. And then we will try and have a look at some ideas and strategies to help those that we support with ASD. Okay, and hopefully you'll be able to help each other with that by joining in the chat. Now, on the left-hand side throughout this presentation will be the chat box. You can add comments, chat away as we go through things. If anything comes to your mind as I'm talking, then type it in. And at various points, I will stop and ask you a question, and you can respond by putting your answer, chatting it, typing it into the chat box. Okay, so that's some of our learning outcomes. If we don't get through all our learning outcomes tonight, which, as I said, I don't think we will, the others that we don't cover tonight will be addressed in a second presentation, so don't worry. Okay, so a little icebreaker activity. Now, I'd like you to type in the box a definition of autism. How would you define autism? And do you feel Asperger syndrome is different from autism? Is it the same thing, just at a different name? Or do you think it is a different condition, a different syndrome rather? I'm refusing to use the words condition and illness and etc., because as we go through this, you'll find out why. Anyway, so can you type in what you feel is a good definition of what autism is to you in your experience of working with young people who have autism or ASD? How would you define it? And do you think it is different? Okay. So Georgina has just put a message on saying that some people are having problems logging in and she's in the process of sorting it out. So Yvonne, welcome Yvonne, you've just joined us. And some other people will be joining as we go along, but as I said, we are just going to keep going. Jodie has put in a comment here. She has said, autism is a communication problem and how they make sense of things around them. People with autism see the world differently from others. Absolutely true, isn't it? That is the kind of classic understanding we have of autism, isn't it? Sarah, good evening, Sarah. And Juliet, good evening. Everybody's now getting on. I think there's been a little technical hitch, hasn't there? But you're all getting there now. So don't worry, those of you who are just getting your link sorted out, we're just started a couple of minutes ago, so don't worry about that. Faye says, I think they don't see the world as we do. Yeah, they definitely don't do. They have an inability to look at the whole world. It seems like a very isolated place to be in, doesn't it, if you're autistic? Lots of people are now typing. They have difficulty forming relationships. Absolutely, yes. Jodie has said she's unsure of the difference between autism and Asperger's. Good. Is anyone else unsure of the difference? Do you think there is a difference? You think there is a difference, Karen? Okay, Yvonne? Yes, it is indeed, Yvonne. The spectrum is so massive that it can present itself in many ways. And to describe people with autism, they see things different way. Yvonne thinks that Asperger's is slightly different from autism. Yeah, Sue, she agrees with Jodie as well. She doesn't feel that there is much of a difference. Yvonne thinks there is a difference. Okay, right. Well, let's find out. Okay, so I'm going to move on. But as I said, carry on typing as we go. It's really good. It's good to see your comments. So a little bit of the historical background of ASD. So although it's only in the last 60, 70 years really that we've had a term called autism known and Asperger's, it's obviously true that people with this syndrome have always existed. It's not a phenomenon of the 20th century. It's just that it wasn't identified and people with that syndrome were not recognised. There's stories and mythology of characters such as the wolf children whose behaviour was unusual, and fairy stories and myths and in old Russia, etc., etc. And Sherlock Holmes, the character, I know he's not real either, but he's thought to have had ASD, although at the time when it was written, obviously, when was that? Victorian times. There was no such diagnosis as autism, but if you think about Sherlock Holmes and you think about the type of character he was, you can definitely see traits there, can't you? But 1943, autism was described the way we know it today for the first time. So this was the man who first made this description, and his name is Leo Kanner, an American. Now, I'm not going to read all this out. As I said, you will get a copy of this PowerPoint if you want to download it. So there's quite a lot of information there about Leo Kanner. So I'm just going to summarise what he did. So in the 1940s, he worked as a child psychiatrist. He did a study on a group of children, 8 boys and 3 girls, and he recognised specific things about this group of children. They had defining features that were clear, that were very different from other children. He was struck by their aloofness, their lack of social responsiveness. They had problems with their speech and communication. They used echolia, so if they did have speech, they would just repeat the same phrases, or they would have lack of speech moderation. They would speak in the one tone all the time. They hated change. They couldn't cope with unfamiliar environments, etc. Some cases they had extreme food fads, and in some cases they had quite good learning ability, good cognitive potential, but they still had all these other overriding factors going on that were hindering them in some way. And he came up with the term autism from the Greek word autos, meaning self, as a reflection of the children's self-interest and their lack of interest in engaging with others around them. So that was when the first term autism came about, and it was Leo Kanner who who devised it. After Leo Kanner, or around about the same time, although for some reason both of these psychiatrists were unaware of the other. Usually today psychiatrists all work together, even if they're in other parts of the world, but it was during the war, if you look at the year 1944, so that might account for it. Now his work was a little bit different because he worked with just boys, and his boys, he followed them for a long period of time, right through to adulthood. And he looked at a lot of the same things that Leo Kanner had found, the lack of communication, the lack of responsiveness, etc., etc. But in some ways they were slightly different in that they could communicate better than those that were described by Kanner. But both Asperger's work was not really taken seriously. It was Kanner's work who was taken seriously right up until 1981, when Lorna Wing, who was another psychologist, she then looked at Hans Asperger's work again, and she came up with Asperger syndrome as being different from autism. So those of you who felt that autism was different from Asperger's, you're not entirely wrong, are you? Because that's what Lorna Wing discovered. So she felt that the differences were in the ability to communicate. So those who were on the autistic spectrum but had low abilities to communicate, or no ability to communicate verbally, or real significant difficulties with it, or difficulties in interacting, coming out of their, even if they could speak, being able to engage with people at any level at all. She described them as autistic, and then she described those as Asperger's, being able to communicate, having quite good communication in some cases, but still with issues around interacting with the world around them. But that was not until 1981, so really relatively recently. So this is a bit of a history. So how it became ASD, autistic spectrum disorder. I was going to say something completely wrong there, but anyway, ignore me. It's Thursday night. So Kanner's work attracted interest internationally, and other important clinicians, they started to look at children and look for similar traits in groups of children. And then other psychologists also started to look at it, and definitions for autism were created, and diagnostic criteria were starting to be sought out and worked on and developed. And in 1979, Lorna Wing, with a team including another psychologist called Gould, they came up with 3 development areas, and these became the kind of cornerstone of diagnosing those on the autistic spectrum, and it became known as the triad of impairments. And you might have heard of that. Yeah, anyone heard of the triad of impairments? Type yes if you have. I'd be quite interested to know if you have. Yes, you have, Stephen. Yes, I think you're right, Yvonne. And in some cases, even now, children with autism are often considered as naughty. We'll talk a little bit about this later, and what the causes for this naughty behaviour that we sometimes think of as naughty behaviour. Absolutely. So, another question for you. So type in your responses to this. So, how many people in every 10,000 do you think have an ASD? And do you think more boys or more males than females have an ASD? If so, what percentage do you think it is? So type in every 10,000 people, how many do you think have an ASD? Oh, Faye says 1,000. Jodie thinks more males. Angie, oh, evening Angie. More males, yeah. So it definitely seems to be more prevalent in boys, doesn't it? I think we would all agree that that is probably the case. Evening Kerry, more males, 85%. Maybe 1/3 of all boys, Yvonne says. Sarah says, more obvious in boys, harder to detect in girls. Ah, I wonder why that could be. Nicola, 20. Some more people type it. Girls internalise, boys externalise, perhaps. Oh, very good. Interesting thoughts. I like it. Okay, I'm going to put you out your misery. Here are the statistics. So, according to the National Autistic Society of the United Kingdom, which is where I got these figures from, because I thought they would be probably the best guide. Because if you Google search this, you will get lots of different figures. But I thought the best one to go with are the National Autistic Society, because they are the United Kingdom's main source of information relating to autism for this country. So it's estimated that 91 out of every, now somebody said 100, didn't they? Oh no, it was 1,000. 91 out of every 10,000 people in Great Britain will have an ASD. And it's estimated that in a population of the United Kingdom, there are about just over 500,000 people who have been diagnosed with an ASD. And you all said this, that at least 4 boys to every 1 girl are diagnosed with an ASD. So it does definitely seem to be much more prevalent in boys than girls. The reason with the diagnosis can be a bit vague is that there's changes going on at the moment. So they've changed how they diagnose autism, and more people are being picked up. And you might be finding this in your schools, that people are being diagnosed at an earlier stage. So although that was the figure last year, you might find in a couple of years' time that figure is quite significantly higher. It doesn't mean that there's more cases of it necessarily. It could mean that there are just more people being picked up who actually have had it for quite a time and it's just not been diagnosed. Oh, who can't see the slides? Can you? Joanne, you can't see the slides? Now, you should be able to, what you should have on your screen is me in the corner, and then underneath that a chat room, and then on the right hand side you should see the PowerPoint slides. Aha. Now Georgina is just typing in something here, so hopefully she's going to sort out whatever this anomaly is. You might, so. Can you see that, Karen and Joanne? You might need to enable add-ons in your computer. Sorry, I'm going to carry on because I'm being distracted by that. Okay, so understanding ASD. So this is from a person called Jim Sinclair, who has autism, and this is what he said, and I think this is very interesting. Autism isn't something a person has or a shell that a person is trapped inside. Autism is a way of being. It's pervasive, it colours every experience, every sensation, perception, thought, emotion and encounter, every aspect of existence. It's not possible to separate the autism from the person, and if it were possible, the person you would have left would not be the same person you started with. I think that's quite profound, and I think when I said earlier on that a lot of people talk about autism as a syndrome, as a disability, as an illness, etc., etc., which I think is why it's very important to try and not think of it in those terms. But as Jim Sinclair says, he's obviously able to articulate himself very well, that it's part of him, it's part of who he is, and if he didn't have the autism, he would be a completely different person. So it's important that we reflect on the information available from the people that we work with who have autism. Not everyone on the spectrum is able to describe their experiences the way that Jim was able to do, but by watching them carefully, by looking at the young people we're supporting carefully, we can often get quite a good idea of what life is like for them by just being very observant to their needs, to what works for them, what doesn't work for them, what troubles them, etc., etc. And we can then help them to be able to work with the world around them a lot better. We might talk about some of the strategies that we could use in a little while. So some of the recognisable features of autism and ASD. An inability to relate to people in social situations from an early life, a marked or profound aloofness. As Canner stated, this was what that stood out to him, this seemingly aloofness. Interestingly, there's been some studies done at the moment in America with babies as young as 6 months to try and diagnose autism earlier, and they found that if they can try and diagnose it much earlier, then they've got a better chance of being able to develop language and being able to communicate more effectively. And they've done studies. So what they've done is they've used children or babies rather, where there are autistic people in the family. So there's an indication that this child could develop autism at some point. And then they've compared it with a child where there's no autism in the family, and they did some tests with them. So they put both babies in a high chair, and they had a person in front of them playing with them with a rattle and distracting them. And the baby with no autism in the family and no tendencies towards it, interacted with the person the way you would expect, laughed, giggled, smiled, tried to grab the object, etc., etc. Just what you would normally expect. But interestingly, the baby who they expected to have some autistic tendencies couldn't focus for any prolonged time on the person in front of her. She was focusing on a tiny dot on the ceiling for most of that time. And it didn't matter how much laughing or how the play person tried to interact with the child, she just didn't really flinch. And it was quite interesting to see this in such young babies at 6 months old. So there are definitely clear indications that the psychologists feel that this child will go on to develop autism. So in many cases with autism, there's a failure to use language or to communicate effectively, particularly with those on the autistic spectrum rather than those who you would think of as diagnosed as Asperger. It tends to be autism, that's the kind of separating, or was. Those on the autistic spectrum could often have very significant communication difficulties. Anxious and obsessive desire to maintain the sameness, yes, you will have come across this. Hate change, cannot cope with change. Fascination for objects, which are handled often with very fine and good motor control. Often it will be tiny little fiddly things, so they will fiddle away with it for ages and ages and ages. You've probably come across this. Good memory, good rote memory especially. Numbers being the one that we know most about. You have savants who can remember years from hundreds of years at a time and be able to tell you statistics from certain years, and it's just incredible, really. Einstein, they often think that Einstein might have autism, and that might have been part of it, his ability to do fantastic mathematical equations, etc., etc. Whether he was or not, I don't know, but there you go. An oversensitivity to stimuli. So the world around them just seems too much, and it's like their senses are enhanced, and they can't cope with, in some cases, touch. They can't cope with food on a plate in some cases because it's just too overwhelming. Their eyes could be oversensitive to light, or the opposite, they could be undersensitive to light and not be able to focus properly on what's around them. Or hearing, often they can have, the ears can pick up really piercing sounds, or just a normal speaking voice can sound piercing to them. But some have very, very good cognitive potential. So there's a real mixture of things going on there, very complex mix of things that go on to try and create, that make up the features of ASD. It's not simple, and you can see it's not, when you're diagnosing it, you can't do a blood test. So it's not like an illness where you can, oh yes, this person has heart disease, or this person has whatever, da 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 da. You can't do that with autism. And it's so different, and so each person who has autism is so unique. My sister has an autistic child, and she sent me this little picture today, and I stuck it on because I thought it was just lovely. Apart from the fact it's a beautiful photograph, and I'm really sorry, a couple of you who, if you still can't see, but you will get the PowerPoint, so don't panic. But it just says, my brother often lives in his own world, but it's okay because they know him there. Sometimes he takes me there too. It's just beautiful, isn't it? Absolutely beautiful. So this was Asperger's findings, which were slightly different from Kanner's. So social impairment, extreme egocentricity, speech and language peculiarities, but often there was good speech there. Repetitive routines, so a lot of them are very similar to Kanner's. Motor clumsiness, so the ability to walk properly, sometimes falling over, or the ability to hold things without dropping them, etc. A narrow field of interests, but within those narrow fields of interest, real specialist interests, non-verbal communication problems, an inability to pick up non-verbal clues. We use body language and facial expressions all the time to help as a mixture with our words, don't we, without even realising we're doing it. And people on the ASD spectrum will be unlikely to be able to pick up on these subtleties. So this is this triad. This was what was devised by Lorna Wing in 1981 as the kind of diagnostic technique and how to work out if a person has autism or Asperger's. So she broke it down into 3 areas. She broke it into social communication, social imagination, or social interaction, or understanding, social understanding of the world around them. And based on a whole battery of tests done around each of these 3 areas, a diagnosis could be made. Okay, so this is it, broke down similar things. So the first one being social understanding, or sorry, I've lost the word here. So interacting with the world around them, inability to do so really, communication, social communication, inability to take on a 2-way conversation. You will often be able to have one-way responses with someone who is autistic, but they won't instigate a conversation often. They might ask something, but they won't be able to often be able to keep it going. Inability to maintain or do much flexible thinking, or lack social imagination. If you watch groups of children playing, those of you who work in early years, I know some of you here do, you have lots of PlayStations, don't you, designed to help develop imagination. Children with autism, you'll often find they're sitting off in a corner. They will play, be very interested in a toy, but it will not be in an imaginative way. It will be about usually how that toy works. They might try and take it apart, they might be interested in what it's made of, etc., etc. But they're unlikely to want to play dolls' houses and the way some people do, or take prams, involve themselves in imaginary situations the way young children do. Right, got a nice little arrow there, which I forgot about. There we go. So Kanner versus Asperger, what are the differences and what are the similarities? So do their descriptions fit with this triad? Is there much difference between the two? Do you recognise this in some of the students that you're working with? I imagine that you do. And a little star. So we're going back to the beginning now of the triad. So we're going to look at it in a bit more depth. So social understanding and the ability to relate to others. The impairment and the ability to understand social behaviour, the lack of ability to be able to pick up social clues. So you can have huge problems with children who cannot pick up social cues. So they wouldn't understand the manners around behaviour, or taking turns necessarily, or please and thank you, or all of the things that we take for granted and that we teach from children from a very young age. you cannot assume that someone on the ASD spectrum will be able to understand that. So you then have to work at ways of helping them to understand how to relate to others, and it has to be done very, very slowly, in very small stages at a time. There's no point in getting annoyed with them, and because that will just result in bad behaviour, or not bad behaviour, but inappropriate behaviour. Because they don't understand. It's not that they're trying to be naughty. They just do not understand how to relate to those around them. They don't understand this social etiquette. It means nothing to them. So what ends up happening is that they end up being isolated, and we don't want that, do we? We want them to try. The idea that they're in a mainstream school is that they can be interact with the peer group and with other children and with other adults as well. So we have to try and help that happen. And it is very difficult, and it has to be done very slowly. It has to be done with the help of the teacher and the help of the parents and the help of the children, because they have to, in some instances, put up with some aspects of bad behaviour or inappropriate behaviour. So it can be very difficult. Yes, they do. They see things at face value. They're very black and white, aren't they? So they can't understand if a child grabs a doll off them, that they were just being a bit rough. They might take that very, very seriously and then just grab it back or whack the child. But in their eyes, they were playing with that doll. That child had no right to take it off of them. And it didn't matter that they had them for that doll for an hour, and that the other child had been waiting patiently and just lost it because she'd been waiting so long. You know, they won't be able to understand that. So you have to help them see it. And part of that is watching the amount of language that we use. I'll come on to language a wee bit further. But if we overpower them by too long and winded explanations that they cannot understand, we've lost them, and we'll never ever be able to get through to them. So we have to watch the amount of language and the amount of instructions that we're giving out to them at any one time. So if you have a behaviour incident, then you might just use one or two words to try and get the child to understand what's gone wrong, rather than giving them a good solid telling off and why you must never do that again and why you must apologise to the child and da 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 da, you know, because you won't get through to them. You'll just isolate them further. So this is another quote from someone who has autism. I've interspaced this PowerPoint with quite a few quotes from people who have autism, because I think it's quite interesting to hear directly from those who have this condition. Sorry, I'm not using that condition. Those who are autistic. So social interactions that come naturally to most of us are very daunting to those with autism. And this person says, as a child, I was like an animal that had no instincts to guide me. I just had to learn by trial and error. I was always observing, trying to work out the best way to behave, but I never fitted in. I wanted to participate, but I didn't know how. So this person, again, as with Jim earlier on, is obviously able to articulate her feelings or his feelings, but still not really be able to fit in properly. But they've obviously tried very hard. So they've looked at how they behave, and they've realised that it's not the way the rest of the world are behaving, and they've tried their best to fit in, but they felt that they just couldn't. Andrew, you've put up your hand. Can you type in what you'd like to ask me? Now Angie has said, I'm going to read this out because this is very interesting. My pupil tells me she loves me. What do you think is the right response in the school environment? Now this is very interesting. In my day, when I was teaching special needs, which isn't that long ago, actually, it's only about 3 years ago, I had someone who used to do that to me as well, because often people with learning difficulties especially can be very, very affectionate, and say things like that to you a lot. So what we used to do in the special schools was we used to teach them about appropriate behaviour. And we kind of drummed that into them from quite an early time so that it went all the way through the school and everybody followed appropriate behaviour. So they ended up, you could say to them, is that an appropriate thing to say to me? Am I your mother? Yes, you love your mother. Yes, you love your father. And, you know, it takes a long time, but you don't really ideally want your one-to-one person having that strong a connection to you, do you? You want them to be working with you, but that's it's overstepping the mark a little bit, isn't it? So trying to teach them about appropriate behaviour and using that exact phrase, that was the phrase we used all the time, was appropriate behaviour. But it takes a long, long time for them to eventually get to it. I had one who used to try and kiss my TA, I used to see him coming. I said, "Now, Ian, is that appropriate behaviour? Do we kiss the teaching assistant? No, no. Who are we? And then who are we allowed to kiss? Who is it appropriate to kiss?" And then he would say, "My mum, my dad, yeah, yeah." And we worked on it like that. But it does take a long, long time. Now, what did Yvonne say? Yeah, I imagine it does happen a lot in early years when children are naturally much more cuddly and much more affectionate. But use the phrase appropriate behaviour. That would be my top tip, and kind of instigate that into as many situations as you can. Is that appropriate behaviour? No. Who is it appropriate to say that to? Who is it not appropriate to say that to? Who is it appropriate to kiss? And you might use some visuals as well, some pictures of his mum or her mum, so that he sees it visually, because people with autism tend to be very, very visual. Oops, what's happened here? Sorry, I moved the cursor. So, potentials to learning. This is in school, this is your main thing, isn't it? This lack of social communication can really hinder any learning that can take place in the school. Or it can be the opposite. You can use it as, if you want to see it as a barrier, then it definitely will hinder learning. But if you see it as an opportunity, then it's an opportunity for you to develop different strategies to help that young person to communicate and to be part of the community of the school. Again, some little little things that are peculiar to people with ASD. So the facial expressions and tone of voice, you've probably come across this, that it can lack, facial expressions can lack expression, and the tone of voice does tend to be monotone. They will not get jokes and sarcasm. So, you know, things that we might say to a mainstream child in a jokey fashion, there's no point in trying that with a child with autism because it just goes over their head or causes confusion. They take words very literally, so when we say words, we must remember that and say them literally as well. Manners of speech, things that I can't actually trying hard to think of a manner of speech that we say regularly, that when we use English words to mean something completely different from what they actually are. But it's failing me at the moment. Speech may vary or be limited, particularly those on the autistic spectrum. They can often have significant communication difficulties. Both Asperger's and autism, they can often have difficulty in giving a two-way type of conversation, a give and take type conversation. They will respond to your questions, but they may not then respond with another part to the conversation that you would expect from another child. And as we said earlier, that they often use the encolia type of communication where they just repeat exactly word for word what has been said previously. So imagination, this inflexible thought, way of thinking and ability to be part of social world around them, it's very difficult in schools because schools are such social places, aren't they? And you want all the children to be part of it. You don't want anyone excluded. But you've got this child who, just by the nature of the ASD is excluded themselves. So we're trying to think of ways that we can break this down. They often have these repetitive actions, so they or self-interests in and be able to play for long periods of time with one object, while the other children are off playing with 6 or 7 different things. We've been 10 minutes on the bike, so now we'll go and play with the ball, and now we'll go and do that. And so they go on. Whereas you could have had the whole break time with this child, one child playing with a tiny toy and be completely lost in that toy. But you can use this to your advantage. Those children that you are working with often will have special interests. So a special interest by, we might think of it as a fascination. They are completely obsessed by something or other. I had a boy one time who was fascinated by dogs. He loved dogs. He could name every type of dog there is, dogs that I have never heard of, but he loved dogs. I think his parents had a dog, and this had started it. Now, how would you use that boy's interest when the rest of the class are learning about Second World War? So they're doing this, the Second World War is the topic, and they've been discussing children at that period of time and what it was like to be a child of their age during the Second World War, and they've been exploring all the different things like evacuation and lack of sweets and etc., rationing, etc., all the things related to the Second World War. And you have this one child who has a special interest in dogs and can name you all these dogs and really understands dogs. And you want him to join in with the others and being part of this topic work about the Second World War. What could you do? Mm-hmm. Yeah, opening and closing the door. So any ideas how you could use this chap who I've described special interests? You're trying to teach about the Second World War from the perspective of children of that age group, and you're trying to desperately to get this boy to join in it in some way. Does any idea what you could do? Some people are typing now. Yes, very good, Yvonne. Did animals have a role in the war? Can you see what Yvonne's saying here? Horses, yes. Now you could try and divert them from dogs to horses. Yes, Faye, excellent. Find something about dogs that concerned the Second World War. What was it like to be a dog in the Second World War? When food was rationed for people, what was it like for dogs? Dogs were obviously not as important. So you could develop it around those areas, couldn't you? And in that way, you've got that boy learning the same topic as the rest of the class, but you're using his special interest to help develop it. Can you see how that could work in other areas as well? Yes, and then you could hopefully develop it about evacuation and farming and dogs in the countryside and what dogs were used for, particularly in this part of the world, in Norfolk. We have sheepdogs and working dogs, etc. Yeah, you could find out, did children have pet dogs? Well done, Kerry. And what happened to them? Yes. And if you wanted to go further, you could look at zoos and what happened to some of the animals in zoos. Maybe not, but there we go. Yeah, so can you see how taking what could be seen as a barrier, a real barrier to learning? Yes, dogs used to detect bombs. Brilliant, Joanne. You're taking what could be seen as a real barrier to learning and you're turning it into a positive. And not only a positive, but actually something that could really benefit the rest of the class, because he's got this special interest in dogs, and I'm sure he would be more than willing to share it with the others in the class, wouldn't he? Yes. So, Sue said her student's interested in video games. I've never heard of Skylanders. But yeah, you're taking the same principle and turning it, so you're using what the special interest happens to be and using that to try and work in with the topic that is being discussed with the class and has been worked on in the class. Yeah, it can put a different spin on it for everybody. Exactly, Yvonne. And everybody learns something from it as well. Yeah, absolutely right, Mel. I think all the children would be really interested to find out what happened to dogs in the war. But yeah, you could use whatever that special interest happened to be, and just a little bit of thought. How could I make this thing? And before you know it, you've got a plan. Another one that seen I watched a video of a presentation done by Yale University, and it was a girl who loved snakes. She was autistic, and she knew every type of snake in America. And the children were learning about the Battle of Gettysburg or some such thing. I don't know much about American history, but there you go, something like that. And they used the snakes. So this snake lived in this part of the world and this part of America, and they worked the whole thing around snakes and developed the whole topic on the Battle of Gettysburg, but involved snakes. So if you can involve in some way how, yeah, so you've got a hard one there. I've never heard of Skylanders. Maybe someone else has. What is Skylanders? Dog puppets, yes. So you're starting to really think here, aren't you? Does anybody know what Skylanders is? I'm assuming it's a modern computer game. But you could use, depending on what the topic was that they were working on, it could be that if he likes computers, you do it on computer. If he's got an interest in computers, then you make a computer type presentation, don't you? If he likes using, if he's good with his computer games, then the chances are he's going to like all things computer. And he might be willing to create a whole presentation using the computer, depending on what age he is and how good he is at computers. A lot of schools, especially secondaries, now teach programming. And you might be able to teach them to program and create little characters and make a kind of cartoon 3D type presentation relating to whatever the topic is. Oh, they are funny little characters. There we go. I've never heard of it, but someone's just told me what they are. They travel through, I think that's perfect. They travel through different places in a portal. So that could be anything, couldn't it? You could relate that to science, you could relate that to history, you could relate that to geography. There's all sorts of ways you could use that. I think that would be brilliant. Excellent. Now everybody knows what Skylanders is, including me. Okay, so moving on slightly. Difficulties with social imagination. They find it hard to interpret other people's thoughts and feelings. They don't read body language, they don't read signals, they don't read clues that we use. So we have to be very explicit and very clear that we are communicating exactly what it is we want that child to know, and don't assume anything. They find it difficult to predict what will happen next or what could happen next. And this relates to the next one with the concepts of danger. So if you're doing anything in school that is heat related, don't assume that that child will know to take their hand away from it when they should. Things like that, because they just might lack the concept of what happens next. So if I put my hand over a Bunsen burner, will it get burned? Oh, I don't know. But let's put my hand over and leave it there. So do not take anything like that for granted. As we've said already, the ability to engage in imaginative play is just missing. It just doesn't happen. Prepare and change and plan for the future, to think ahead. Again, it just doesn't happen. So they might be able to think of maybe a day or two ahead, but not really the way that we would expect normal children to be able to think ahead. So talking about a holiday in the future might not necessarily mean anything to a child who has ASD. And A common one that I think you probably all have found is coping with unfamiliar situations. Change is difficult. Change in any format is really difficult. So it could be just a different teacher, it could be a different classroom, it could be the classroom has changed layout. So the teacher came in over the weekend, decided she was going to have a new layout, didn't warn the child, and he comes in on Monday morning, and the class is in all different groups, and he goes berserk. And it's just because he cannot cope with the change. So anything like that has to be worked in. And I'm not suggesting that you don't change anything and that you keep these routines firmly, but when you do change things, you give it a period of time and you do it small adjustments at a time and allow time for the child to make those adjustments at very slow stages. Now, when you really can have real problems is if you have a different teacher or a different teaching assistant. And especially in your position, if you're supporting in that classroom and it's suddenly you've got a supply teacher or a cover teacher, and that child is just not going to be able to cope with it, what do? You're the one-to-one for that child. You know what the problem is. You know that that child is just unhinged, really. You know, he cannot cope. He cannot deal with the fact that it's not his normal teacher. Is it fair to try and keep him in that classroom? Is it fair to try and cajole him into being able to be part of that lesson? Really, I would suggest that in that instance, it might be safer and it might be better that you think ahead and say, actually, he will not cope with this. Let's go into a quiet room, or let's go into another room that he's familiar with that we can work away at. Rather and it's preempting what might happen in those situations that will save you a lot of worry and a lot of problem. You know, just thinking ahead a little bit. Sue has said, yes, secondary school is very difficult, especially when they first change from primary to secondary, because they've had a set number of teachers, a set number of teaching assistants, a set number of pupils, and over those 6 years in the primary school, they've got comfortable with that, and there might have been some change, but it's not drastic. And then they come up to secondary school and it's massive, and there are hundreds of people they don't know, and then every hour or so they're changing classroom. You know, it's very, very difficult. Yeah, supply teacher. A visual timetable, well done, Joanne. A visual timetable is an excellent strategy to help. Yeah, and especially if it's photographs. If it's actual photographs relating to actual things in that child's day-to-day life, then he can really visualize what's happening next. That can be a real help. So they love routines. They do not like those routines to be broken. Sensory sensitivity. In all the senses, in the level 3 qualification that we do a whole topic on sensory sensitivity. But if you think about, I'm just going to think about the eyes actually. So if you imagine what it's like, try and imagine what it's like to walk into just a general primary school classroom. You've got notice boards all the way around, you've got lots of colour, you've got children's work, you've got displays, you've got posters, you've got things dangling down from the ceiling, you've got all sorts of things going on there. And your eyes are oversensitive to movement, to colour, to light, and you're walking in on that. It can be very overpowering, can't it? So what do? Obviously, you cannot take apart a whole classroom for one child, but bearing in mind that this is, although it's part of the autism, it is real. This sensory distortion is real, and it can be painful and it can be traumatic. So noticing that child is struggling with the light in the class or the movement in the class, it might be your cue to move them into a quieter area. But being aware of it, and sometimes this will manifest itself in the child staring at one spot for a prolonged period of time. And they do that because it stops them focusing on everything else. So they just look at this tiny spot. So it can appear that they're fascinated by a spot on the wall or a spider or something, but actually what it is they're trying to focus their eyes out of everything else that's going on round about them to try and help them cope rather. Special interests, using these special interests to help them learn is a real key. Not seeing them as somehow problematic, having a special interest, but using whatever those special interests are to help them learn. And often, along with autism, will be learning difficulties. Sometimes with Asperger's, you will have high functioning people with Asperger's who don't have a learning difficulty as such. But with autistic children, you will usually have learning difficulties as well. Okay, so this is a summary of the triad. And again, don't worry about trying to write this down because you can download the PowerPoint. But this is quite a good way to remember the triad. So social understanding, so social communication and flexibility of thought or imagination. So this is the three key areas that it's broken up to make a diagnosis of ASD. So social understanding, the finding space too restrictive, the lacking of normal space perception, what we would presume to be normal, vision intermittently blurred and then normal, or sometimes not able to focus at all, hearing, again, the same problems that they have with their eyes, exactly the same problems with ears, oversensitive to very high noises or the opposite to low noises, obsession with time and punctuality. If they go to bed at 8 o'clock one night, they will have to go exactly at 8 o'clock. It can't change. So precision, it's connected to this not liking change. And then social communication, unable to make eye contact very often during conversation. That can be really worked on. It takes a lot of work, but you can work on, and it's a good thing to do, to work with your child at making eye contact during conversations. And two-way conversations as well, very difficult. Interrupts in conversations, but cannot determine when they should interrupt and when they shouldn't interrupt. Cannot hear or understand spoken words at some points. Don't understand taking turns or listening to cues that we normally have in communication. It says at the bottom here, crave to be touched, but also repulsed by it. And that goes back to this hypersensitivity again, because it's like the sense of being touched, the touch sense. They want to be touched just as all human beings do, but it's too much. They find it too overstimulating and they can't bear it. And then flexibility of thought and imagination. Obsession with numbers is a very common one. Intensely preoccupied with repetitive motions, spinning something on the table like a coin, etc. Or hand flapping. You might have come across the hand flapping. Fixation on one thing. And as I said before, sometimes this fixation isn't necessarily a fixation for a fixation's sake. It's to try and block out the world around them, especially when it comes to light or sound. Compulsive behaviours. Again, trying to numb out the world around them because it's too much to take in. So the compulsive behaviour is compensating for the world that's around them that they're not able to cope with. Fascinations with signs and symbols, again, because they're such visual learners. So anything visual is a real stimulus to them, and they can develop real fascinations with them, wanting to understand every peculiar angle on a sign. Road signs being one of the ones that can be quite common, counting them and memorising them as well. So this is the triad of diagnosis that was developed in 1981 by Lorna Wing, but it's based on the findings of Hans Asperger and Leo Kanz. And as some of you said back at the beginning, that there is a distinction between Asperger's and autism, but nowadays we tend to put the two together and a child will be given a diagnosis of ASD, so they will be on that spectrum. Okay, so just to confuse things slightly further, that just last year there was a new method of diagnosis created called the dyad of diagnosis, where they put social understanding and social communication together as one heading, really. And they're starting to use that as well. But in many cases, they've not used it instead of the triad of diagnosis. They've used it as well as, because they found that for some diagnoses it works better. But the jury is out on it. There are many clinicians who don't agree with it, so that might be something that you're interested in. You might want to do some work on it. Again, if you do a qualification in autism, you will research both the triad and the dyad. I've just kind of given you a summary of it tonight. So it is 8:30, and I promised you I wouldn't keep you all night. So hopefully you've got a bit of an understanding of some of the terminology used to describe Asperger's and autism. The triad of diagnosis being the key one. We've looked at the distinctions between the different elements involved in that triad, and we've only just touched on it really because it's such a huge topic, but the implications in your classroom and how you could use the specialist areas of interest with the autistic person as a method of helping them to learn, rather than seeing it negatively, seeing it positively. Okay, so I'm just going to read out some of your comments because you've all been typing away massively fast while I've been talking. So now some of you are talking about a specific room. I think Yvonne's talking about, I'm assuming this is a sensory room or a quiet room, that she takes children to be calm. Yes, and she's saying about noise in assembly, that can be a real problem, I can imagine. Ear defenders, yes. Ear defenders can be quite helpful, because even if actually I don't think they really do block out much sound, in fairness, but they're physical and they give that child the feeling of control. So he puts the ear, or she puts the ear defenders on, and it's a method that he uses or she uses to try and block out some of the overpowering sound that's going on around them. And as you can imagine, in an assembly or sometimes just in a busy classroom, it can just be overwhelming. And just the physical act of putting the ear defenders on helps them to be able to block out some of what's going on. Yeah, neutral colours is a common thing to use if you have an autistic child at home. You're often told by the educational psychologist to not give their bedroom lots of bright colours because they find it too overstimulating, but to keep it calm and more neutral colours. But as I said earlier, that can be very difficult in a classroom, isn't it? Yeah, sensory rooms. In your sensory room, you would naturally keep it calm because that's the whole point of it. Yeah, wooden toys, wooden resources, and textures like Hessian natural textures can be really useful. Okay, so that is the end of this presentation. I hope that you found it informative. And as I said, it's such a huge topic, autism, that we will be returning to it, and we'll do another presentation in a later date, which goes in much more detail about strategies for helping and working with autistic children in your classrooms. So I'm going to switch my sound off in just a minute, but I'm going to leave the programme running for 10 minutes or so that you can carry on chatting to each other. You're welcome, Angie. Yeah. And as I said at the beginning, you can download the PowerPoint and you will be able to listen to the presentation again. You'll be sent a link and it will be online for about a month. So thanks very much to everybody for taking part. It's been great. It's been a really busy presentation with lots of you having lots of input into what's been happening and what you've been discussing and the things that you've been using in your school. So it's been great. So thanks very much for all of that. It's been brilliant. And I will hopefully see you all or hear from you all again soon. So good night, and I'm going to switch my sound off now. Apologies. I've just remembered that I forgot to ask you to do this. There's a little, two little boxes on here, one about the session and one that asks you to list any topics that you would like to see covered in a future presentation. So if you've got some ideas, we'd love to hear them. So if you can type them in there. And in this one, it asks you to give a little nod to how much you enjoyed the session or not, but just give a vote. Okay. Now, on the right-hand side down here, where my cursor is, you can see the presentation, the PowerPoint, so you can download that just now if you want to. And that is definitely me. I'm going to stop talking now. Okay. So good night again. But again, carry on chatting to each other. The page will stay live for about 10 minutes or so. Okay.